questions through, and so I'll go through them. One of the trickiest things I find is I find what I like to try and do as I'm sort of interviewing people is uncover, first of all, things that most people don't necessarily know.
Yeah.
But also things that you haven't talked about, and obviously you do quite a lot of pieces to camera on your own feed, all of which I've watched. And then you think you cover so much, you're quite a challenge in trying to come up with like ideas and things to talk about that you've not already sort of like whimsically mused on and talked about already. So I've tried to do that. But anyway, let's go from the beginning. I did read, so kicking off with sort of where it all started. I did read that it was the New York kind of graffiti inspiration. So when I suppose what inspired you to first pick up a spray can, but what was it about that sort of New York scene? What was it you saw that thought, that's what I want to do?
Well, like when I was growing up, literally, when I say that, I'm saying like between the ages of literally from about 8 to about 13, you know, them kind of years, just as you were entering teenagers, everything was about New York. Everything that came across, whether it was the films like Superman, like Ghostbusters, like everything was New York. We just grew up, our minds were in New York. Everyone we knew was, even though I'm in Hull, do you know what I mean? Like a small city on the east of England. It's like everybody was fantasizing about New York with everything they did, whether it was the clothes they wear, the music they listened to, it's just them days back then as a kid, that was what we dreamed of, was that big massive metropolis. You know, if you're in a kind of, I mean, Hull's not a small town, it's a big city really, but you know, that the glamour and glitz of New York was
it's not the Upper West Side.
No, you're right. Yeah. I mean, but for me it was like electro music. We was listening to that, like, and breakdancing, really, like literally out in the front of the house on a cardboard box, or like in the city centre, people at the weekend would come with like rolls of lino into the kind of the gardens in the centre and do breakdancing, and everybody would stand around and watch, and they'd listen on these massive like cassette players, and that was it. That was, everyone was kind of emulating America. I don't even want to say it was just New York, because it was Los Angeles as well.
Yeah.
It was, everyone was like an America-phile, you know. It's like, so that's kind of, so it was like a natural progression into that. But the graffiti thing literally came, I wouldn't like to say it was like by accident, but it literally came into my life. Like, we'd have BMXs and all that New York thing was going on, you know, BMX Bandits, the Goonies, loads of stuff about America. But it was also about spraying them bikes. That was like quite new then, you know, the ability to be able to colour something in. So like, you'd obviously go to your mate's big brother's shed when you had a puncture or something like that. And in that shed, their dad would have some Casper or something like that. So obviously, when you're kind of bored, you're like, oh, let's try and draw a penis on the wall, or, you know, write your name, your nickname. And that first kind of attempt was like such a challenge. It was like it was like the Rubik's Cube or something like that. You really wanted to, I personally wanted to try and do that again. It was a bit like doing the windmill when you're breakdancing, or doing the electric boogaloo. You're constantly wanting to practice all these moves. So
were you a breakdancer?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, that before graft, everybody was into that kind of stuff around me, around my friends and people who I kind of admired, were these lads in like silky feeler tracksuits, you know.
I'm guessing there's no old like 80s VHS footage knocking around.
There probably is, you know, but not. Yeah, there probably is. I mean, that was the days then. I mean, it was all VHS, wasn't it? It was like that. I mean, I remember actually looking in magazines where you get the steps of how to do the various dance moves and stuff. Like, but to get back to the question about how I actually got into graff, it wasn't really the actual graffiti that I got into. It was the idea of spraying. It kind of, I liked the rebelliousness of it, the challenge of it, the kind of out of reach thing, you know. It was like the spray can was like back then it was like, whoa, what is that? What you felt so powerful with it as a young kid, you know. So obviously, yeah, I started to see the graffiti spray can art. You saw it in all of the videos anyway, but to actually draw that was really difficult, and actually to decipher what it was about. Why are people writing their names everywhere? It wasn't readily available, you know. It was
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I'd see stuff at school on people's bags, or I'd see an arrow at the end of someone's name, and it'd be like, wow, yeah, this is something I like, you know. I'm trying to decipher what it says. A bit like when you look at Japanese writing, or you know,
Mm.
I'm fascinated by it. So that's what got me into it, combined with the spray can. It wasn't like, oh, I want to go and paint trains because that's what I've seen from New York at all. It was more just like a journey from the start. It was like an exploration. It was like, yeah, obviously I want to do what I've seen in spray can art and subway art, but it wasn't about trying to emulate that. It was just an experiment that had
Mm.
got out of hand, you know, and the
So
results were
popular
like,
culture sort of plays a role then, because not everyone who's sort of 9, 10 years old is buying like Henry Chalfont books on street art
exactly,
photography. There,
yeah,
there's a time during the 80s when I suppose there's more cable or satellite coming, and there's more of an influx of American programs, I guess, that
yeah.
we're consuming as kids that makes you think,
Computer games, yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
that was it. Yeah, it was emulation. It was the idea of. I think that's what graff and b-boying and hip hop in general at that time. Well, because that's kind of what we got into was hip hop. It took you out of your normal state and took you into something different. Like you could imagine you was a iced tea, or you know, you could imagine you was like, you know, the DJs, or do you know. And I think that was what was great about it back then for us young kids, really. You know, it
so
wasn't,
go on.
that was it. Yeah, it was more about like taking you out of your mindset and giving you a fantasy to live towards, you know, or believe in, or try out, or practice.
So
It
you
was
you're
about
you're
practice, yeah.
you're spending time in warehouses, and you talked about kind of like beautification of sort of rundown buildings. This is sort of in your teens. There's a kind of a gap in the middle of sort of the 8, 9, 10-year-old you who's finding these spray cans, and the teenager who's actually doing stuff in what's in the middle.
The middle bit between like going out, what, as in like,
You
I mean,
picked up the
yeah,
spray
what do you mean, like
cans. You picked up the spray
smoking
cans.
fags? You
Right,
know,
right, in your
the
mate's dad's shed.
rebelliousness, yes.
Exactly. That's what I want to get to, because you don't suddenly jump into them being able to create these big, beautiful murals in these warehouses. There's a bit in between
No,
where you're learning and you're getting busted and you're running around spraying things. What was that? What's that story?
well, back then, like, because I lived near a park, like quite a big, like open park, so we'd go in there at night, but it would be full of glue sniffers. Like back in the like late 80s, like late 80s, early 90s, everyone was sniffing glue, and they were all like punks, you know, like with the Mohicans or skinheads and stuff like that. So that was like quite nightmarish, because you never know, because they'd always do it in quite big groups. You know,
Yeah.
there'd be like 10 or 11 of people glue sniffing, you know, in the park down. I want to get to a wall over there, so like me and a friend would probably be really aware that there could be a gang of these people that are really high, tripping their heads off on solvents. You know, that was just a really twisted little thing that was like one of the obstacles. Like, obviously, I'll keep reminding you, I'm not living in London. I'm not living in a
Yeah.
massive city, so I'm still having to navigate these kind of situations. But it was that getting over and climbing fences and stuff like that, that being in places where you're not really supposed to be was the thrill of it. Really, it wasn't really about destruction or damage or getting up. It was just about the adventure. And like, I think that's because there's so many like derelict buildings or unused buildings, let's say. It was quite easy to get into these places, or that's
Yeah.
where you'd spend your time. If it was raining, for example, it's like, well, what's the point of standing outside? I might as well go in that like old warehouse hut or stand there. And then rave scene came about. So we'd be like organizing parties inside these buildings with, and like at first, as I said, it was just like cassette players. But then a couple of mates had Technics decks and a generator. You know, we're starting to get older, and we'd literally be carrying these decks, these really heavy decks, and this would be belonging to Lee Butterfield. And literally, if you get a fingerprint on it, you're getting a punch in the face. Do you know? And just like so, but we get there, we set it all up like Sunday afternoon, and you know. We're having like mad reggae parties in these old abandoned building sites, you know, and like we're just painting on the wall, you know, we're giving the visual entertainment to these parties. So it was all about that. It was like it was making use of what you've got, and I think that's what's beautiful about this culture. It's like taking a very little bit and making the most of it, and that's a lot about what my work is about. I may only have like that much pink or that much blue in a can, but I try and make make the most of that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about that economizing what you do and making it bigger than what it is and expanding it.